those who joined the session earlier this morning, it follows on quite nicely. They were looking at the next steps for land rights and responsibilities, and we will be focusing on putting the statement into practice. We'll hear from our panel of land managers on how they have engaged with the statement. We heard earlier that implementation isn't a one-size-fits-all, and this is our opportunity to hear right from the horse's mouth how it has worked for them and the benefits, opportunities and challenges they have faced in doing so. So first off, I'd like to introduce Tom Bowser. Tom is owner and head ranger of the Argaty Red Kite project at Lerrocks Farm. He's also a nature writer, journalist and wildlife guide. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, so to tell you a little bit about me and what we do first, Argaty is a 1,400-acre beef and sheep farm located near Doon in central Scotland. As Lucy says, if you know us already, it's probably for the Argaty Red Kite and Red Squirrel projects, which my parents set up the Red Kite project back in the early 2000s after kites have been reintroduced to this area. When they came and started nesting on our farm, people came wanting to see the birds, which have been absent in our area for such a long time. And my parents took the view that rather than trying to keep people away, to keep the birds safe, it was better to allow people to come in, see them and appreciate them. And this really set us up on a whole new road for opening up our estate to people and allowing people to come and visit. In recent times, we've set up our Red Squirrel project as well, set up viewing hides, and really taken bigger leaps into the world of nature tourism, trying to allow people to come and see the wildlife we have here and enjoy it. The farm has been in our family now since 1916, and it's always been very much drilled into us that it's a privilege to have this land, to have this opportunity. So we've always believed in trying not only to produce food in a sustainable way, but to make the farm a home for nature as well as for ourselves. So certain aspects of the land rights and responsibility statement have really been part of our ethos before we even knew that there were such things as statements on these topics. So the good stewardship part of it really has been very much part of what we do for a very long time. So to paint a picture of how we've been implementing that, about a fifth of Argaty is woodland, and most of that is connected by hedgerow corridors. We have 16 ponds here now, 4 acres of wildflower meadow that we've sown in the last few years. And as well as these more kind of top-down conservation practices that we've put into place, we've also been allowing a fair bit of rewilding to happen on the place too. So we have large areas where the gorse runs wild, making a good home for nature. Areas of scrubby birch that we just allowed to develop and then we coppice slightly. So these things have been very much part of our practice, a good stewardship part. But I think as we take steps further into the nature tourism side of our business and diversify further to that, other aspects of the statement have become more important to us. Transparency is a big thing. In fact, it's something that really we have started to try and build our business upon, working to develop a good social media presence and explain what we're doing and why. In particular, in recent times, we've been trying to connect up the disconnected habitats on the farm, so putting in new woodlands and hedgerows to link up these parts so that then wildlife has freedom of movement. And we've been trying to explain the importance of that. We're trying to engage more and more with the local community as well with projects. So in recent times, we have been applying to see if we could have beavers that are being culled in other areas of Scotland moved to ponds here. We're further away from prime agricultural land. We have beavers within range here anyway. And in many ways, we would be a pretty good site to have these animals moved to. So we're doing big community consultations on that front, working with the community in other senses as well, doing bird box making projects with local primary schools, and looking at ways that we can integrate our business into the local climate action groups and do work with them. So stewardship was our way into all of this, but now that we've taken more steps, aspects such as transparency and community engagement are becoming more and more crucial to us and proving to be good ways of building awareness of our business and what we do.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Tom. And I think the use of different tools and how you use those to get through to work with the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement, something that we might want to touch on a little bit later in our discussion. I'd now like to introduce Duncan Orr-Ewing, Head of Species and Land Management for RSPB Scotland and part of the RSPB Scotland Senior Leadership Team. His remit encompasses the management of RSPB Scotland land holdings, its species recovery and policy work, its species and habitat conservation advice to other landowners, and its work and public authorities in combating wildlife crime. He also represents RSPB Scotland on a number of Scottish Government and other groups.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and good morning, everybody. Like Tom, I'm just going to give a bit of context first and then explain how we're engaging with some of the Scottish Land Commission initiatives and guidance. So firstly, hopefully RSPB Scotland doesn't need too much introduction, but we are a major landowner in Scotland. We own or manage 78 sites and have 72,000 hectares of land. Our two largest UK sites are in Scotland. Our largest is at Forcenard in the Flow Country of Caithness and Sutherland, and our second largest is at Abernethy in the Cairngorms. And we also, perhaps uniquely, have land holdings from the north to the very south of Scotland. We own or manage land on Shetland and down to the Mull of Galloway. We are, of course, a charitable landowner, and our charitable purpose is set out in our charter, and that is to manage land for conservation and for public education. Like most charities, we're governed by a UK council, but for a very long time, we've also had a Scottish committee who advise our work, and Scottish committee members are drawn from all areas of interest and people who we think can offer support and guidance on our work. And of course, the latter has been given sort of increased impetus by Scottish devolution since the early 1990s. Well, the way we manage our land, we look on it very much that we're helping to deliver the public interest, primarily, of course, in our case, in terms of delivering biodiversity and helping the Scottish Government meet its international commitments for wildlife conservation. I should also say that 95% of the land that we own or manage is notified as a SSSI or as Natura. So, you know, we have strong obligations there as well. And I would say really at the outset, we don't claim to get everything right, but, you know, over the years, we have had an emphasis on trying to be a good neighbour and engage as much with local communities in the areas as we work as possible. We typically employ site staff who either live on site or live in local communities near their work. And we tend to use local contractors as well, I should say. Not all our land is owned, as I've alluded to, some is leased. So for example, in the Western Isles, we've worked for 50 years with the crofters at Balranald, our Balranald Reserve. We don't own any land there. All of the work that we do there on our nature reserve is in conjunction with the local crofters in that area. Should also say that much of our land is farmed, so we do work with local graziers. In many places, we don't tend to own livestock, although there are some places where we do. For example, on Islay, we have our largest in-hand farming operation in the UK. And I should say when we are in the business still of acquiring land where we can, where it meets our objectives, but it has been our policy for many years to dispose of surplus assets. So, for example, just to give an example of this, recently in the past 5 years, we acquired some additional land at our Inch Marshes Reserve in Strathspey, which also came with some cottages which were surplus to our requirements. And we did dispose of those cottages. We sold them on the open market, and they've now been taken up by local people. I should add, we've also been in the process for a few years of registering all our land, and we are close to completion of that exercise. So nearly 98% of our land is now registered. So with the Scottish Land Registry, and we see that as increasing openness and transparency. Just a bit of final background on our operation, which I think should be informative, is that for many years we've been in the business of having management plans for all of our sites. Typically these last 5 years, but in some places they're 10 years. So for remote seabird islands and that kind of thing, they tend to be where we're not doing a lot of land management operations. They can be for 10 years, but mostly for 5 years. And it's been our policy for some while to consult with local communities over those management plans when they're reviewed every 5 years. And since all our land is notified, or nearly all our land is notified, Nature Scot also have a strong voice in ensuring that the designated features of our land holdings are managed in the way that they see and to meet our statutory obligations. So we do consult, of course, with Nature Scot. So just recently, what have we been doing with the Scottish Land Commission? I'll just finish with that. We have had some community consultation guidance that we've had for quite a long while. We reviewed that against the Scottish Government and Scottish Land Commission guidance to make sure that it was up to date and fit for purpose. And we've shared that with both Scottish Government and the Scottish Land Commission. Very recently, we've held a very useful seminar led by Scottish Land Commission colleagues for as many of our staff as possible. In fact, we had very good attendance at that event. And, you know, at that event, Scottish Land Commission were able to share some of their best practice guidance and to get our sort of response to that. So we've involved a lot of our staff in this process. The guidance, I have to say, from SLE has been very helpful, and we're trying to collaborate closely there. We have now been going through the self-assessment process, and what we have done there is tabulate all of the main actions from the Scottish Land Commission guidance, and then basically RAG rate, red, amber, green rate ourselves against the actions that are in that guidance. And, you know, clearly some areas we're performing better than others, and other areas there's need for improvement. And we've tried to draw out of that the areas where we need to make more effort. So we've been through that process, and just to give you a flavour of where we think we need to make improvements, we think we need to do more consultation around big projects that happen on our land within our 5-year management plan period. And we also are conscious that we need to improve our web material and availability of, you know, readily available contacts that communities can get in touch with, although we think a lot of our site staff do know their communities pretty well, but we can do better. So in summary, just to finish up, to say we've started on a journey. We want to work closely with SLC to learn and improve. I should add that finally that our UK corporate strategy, which has just been announced, also gives a firm commitment to improving our engagement with communities. So I'll leave it at that point.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for that. I think what we're already seeing come through here is that everybody is treating this as a journey, and we are all tapping into it in different ways. And obviously the different scales of many different landowners and land managers means that different people are interpreting it in different ways. And I think that's a really interesting thing for our audience to be able to hear. I'll hand now over to Chris Cassels. Chris is Senior Asset Manager at Crown Estate Scotland and is involved in rural land and estate management, conservation management, and rural tourism and community interests.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Lucy. Also, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm actually standing in for one of my colleagues at short notice, but it's been a really interesting conference so far. So a bit like the other members of the panel, Crown Estate Scotland are also on a journey, being a relatively new body set up in 2017. But we have a clear purpose, obviously, in investing in property, natural resources, and people to generate lasting value for Scotland. And as a public body, we're on that journey to look at creating value beyond financial return and enabling other bodies to take on management responsibilities as well, which is, you know, is, as a new body, we're trying to listen and understand what, in the context of the wider Scottish context. So I suppose from a perspective today, I was trying to pick a few examples that exemplify some of these principles, particularly around diversification of ownership, good stewardship, and community engagement. My role in Crown Estate Scotland is within the property team. We manage rural and coastal assets right across Scotland. As some of you will be aware, we own quite a lot of the foreshore around Scotland. We've got a lot of coastal communities that we engage with. We've got 4 rural estates, 2 up in at Glenlivet and Fochabers in the northeast, and then Whitehill Estate in Midlothian and Applegirth down in Dumfries and Galloway. So quite a geographic spread. And that's not touching on the other wider energy and marine aspects of our business as well. So I thought I'd focus on the sort of rural and coastal ones particularly. So I picked a couple of examples. The first one is an example of where we're working with Port Gordon Community Harbour Group. Port Gordon Harbour is an asset that we own on the northeast coast. And earlier this year, we went into a memorandum of understanding with the Harbour Group, so that both working with both organisations to work towards a transfer of ownership of the harbour to the group by 2023. This would see potentially the harbour itself and other assets perhaps in the village transfer across to the hands of the community to help them with their regeneration and development. The new agreement, I think, is a culmination of work done prior to that, which saw the community group carry out a planning for real exercise in 2017, and also the Crown Estate Scotland also working with a consultant to develop options for sort of greater community involvement in the harbour. And that helped pull together some of those ideas. And what's come out of it is really positive, I think, and we're now working with that group actively. We've acquired another building adjacent to the harbour to help facilitate that future potential. We've set up a harbour advisory group working with the community, and we've just reached agreement over a community development officer post to help take those forward. So I hope you see that as a sort of example of a different model, but hopefully one is still work in progress, but it's a sort of looking to the future as well. The second example relates to our local management pilots, which we launched in 2018. The aim was to encourage greater involvement of Scotland's communities in managing land and property that is near to them. The scheme allows for sort of partnerships with bodies, whether they be local authorities or development trusts or others. And in the autumn of 2020, we entered into an agreement, our first agreement with 4th District Salmon Fishery Board, which sees them take on extra responsibilities for the Crown Estate Scotland's salmon fishing rights in the 4th District. That's an agreement which we hope anyway is developing greater involvement in that fishery, and handing on them to sort of grasp that and promote it, with the aim being of encouraging better fishing, but also underutilized ones, but also hopefully generating that input into that locally. We're part funding a project officer for 2 years to help forth with that, and then encourage that. So we hope to see a benefit in more fishing becoming available, but also creating that local investment into or buy-in to those. So that was another example, I think, of stewardship, but also a different model of enhance those, sort of looking at how we can work with people. And the third example I was going to pick was Whitehill Estate. In August this year, we were working with our consultants, Terra Nova Scotland. We've launched the Whitehill Estate 2030 conversation, which is a community engagement exercise on Whitehill Estate in Midlothian, and how to make this a sort of positive place for people to work and live and visit. For those of you who don't, it's sort of situated on the south of Roslin and Bonnyrigg, and centres around Rosewell, Rosenley and Upper Dalhousie communities. It was an estate that was obviously purchased in 1969 and is widely recognised for its agricultural and mining heritage. So we started a conversation to glean insights into how we can shape a strategic vision for the estate. This is the first phase of that has just been completed, which involved some setting up an online platform so that people could see a virtual village hall, and that's generated all sorts of debates and comment and feedback, which has been really good, as well as traditional things using posters and postcards and things via Rosewell Steading. So that we're collating that feedback, working with our consultants, obviously, and we'll share that with the community and go on to do a further phase of consultation and engagement with the community in mid-October. But anyway, the outcome of all of this, I think, is trying to show, obviously, that that's engaging with the community in different ways, but also to help inform a development framework, which could inform a submission into the Midlothian local development plan. So those are sort of three examples, if you like, of how we're looking at different ways of dealing things. We have lots of other ways that we're obviously doing it. We have a lot of our property is tenanted. We work quite a lot with our farm tenants and our other tenants, our coastal tenants, and obviously a lot of that is working in partnership all the time. And indeed, we're working obviously we have quite a lot of work with the Tenant Farming Commissioner within the Scottish Land Commission as well, in working jointly on how we manage our estates and how we can improve that. So I hope you see that from a business anyway, we're trying to take on multiple roles of an asset manager, an enabler, an investor, and a coordinator. And those are 4 roles that we see as integral to how we operate and work with communities, and hopefully demonstrate that we're putting those rights and responsibilities into practice. It's still a journey, as the other speakers have said too, but a very positive one. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think a good reinforcement there that this isn't just about rural land, and these principles can be used in a variety of settings, which is probably a very good segue into our final panelist, Al Reid. Al joined the board of Action Porty in 2018, the first urban community right to buy in the country. He's a public servant involved in the research and scrutiny of a broad range of environmental and sustainable development issues.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And just to make it clear that I'm a voluntary board member and speaking solely on behalf of Action Porty today. And Action Porty, who own and run Belfield, a former church and halls, on behalf of the community of Portobello, Edinburgh's seaside suburb. Now, we are the smallest landowner here today, with approximately 1 whole acre of listed Georgian church building and 1960s built community halls that are now primarily used as a community hub and event space. Action Porty is a company limited by guarantee and a registered charity run by a voluntary board, and purchased in 2017. And as Lucy has noted, we're proud to be the first urban community to have used community right to buy legislation to secure ownership. In addition to providing space for events, classes, and startup businesses, we are also committed to tackling the twin climate and biodiversity crises and to enabling our community to do the same. We have installed solar panels and battery storage, insulated the former church, transformed an unused patch of gravel into a community garden, and we're currently seeking planning permission for an e-cargo bike storage hub to reduce transport emissions from journeys with larger loads. Around a year ago, we took part in the pilot self-assessment of land rights and responsibilities framework. And there are 6 key principles against which we were asked to assess ourselves on a scale of 1 to 6, with 1 being basic and 6 being excellent. So with an eye on the time, I will run through very briefly, Lucy, if that's okay, what we found. The first principle relates to promoting, fulfilling and respecting relevant human rights in relation to land and ensuring that there's a balance between public and private interests. Against this, we assessed ourselves as good at level 4 on that scale of 1 to 6, because Belfield is managed by the community in the public interest. And we considered that balancing the public interest of the asset and the private interest of our neighbours, we're in a residential street, we considered that balancing that interest was crucial. Equally, the provision of affordable and safe public space to gather and play was our main contribution to the realisation of human rights, and the evolving programme of renewable energy provision and improvements to biodiversity and the streetscape also played a role in the human right to a healthy environment. The second principle related to there being a more diverse pattern of land ownership and tenure, with opportunities for citizens to own, lease and have access to land. Now, we again assessed ourselves as being good in this respect because our focus here was on having access to the asset. You know, we are open to inquiries from all residents and businesses to use our facility, and we have differing rates for rents of the space, so relating to charities, relating to not-for-profits, relating to community businesses. Essentially, if we can make it work and provide space, then we will. The third principle relating to more local communities having the opportunity to own, lease or use assets and contributing to community well-being and future development. Again, this we considered tied back to the second principle in simply that we are open to all approaches for hire and use of the buildings and grounds. And if we can make it work in favour of our community and in favour of providing space for people to gather, then we will. Moving on to the fourth principle, which relates to meeting high standards of land ownership, management and use and fulfilling these responsibilities, we considered ourselves to be sort of somewhere in the middle, to be satisfactory, so sort of 3 on this scale of 1 to 6. And simply that we considered it to be the development and management of Belfield to be work in progress. We send out regular newsletters to our members. We also send out a quarterly communication with near neighbours in letter and in person. But our, again, just carrying on with this theme of a journey, is that we have a very diverse board with different professional interests, but none of us have ever really run a community facility before. So we're learning as we go. And we have also made mistakes in relation to communication with neighbours and not communicating adequately or in good time with neighbours. And they have let us know that. And, you know, we're working to improve that communication and to consult regularly and to listen to what they have to say. Fifth principle relates to improved transparency of information. And in this case, we again considered our actions really to be satisfactory, because this interacts with what I've said previously about how we interact with neighbours and how we communicate with the wider community. You know, we're open and accessible. All of our names and profiles are on our website, and we all live very, very close to the facility. In fact, I'm looking out of my front window at it now. So we hope to be as open and accessible as possible, but something that Stephen from Scottish Land and Estates said in the last session particularly chimed with me, is that we can't always do what everyone wants, and we can't always please absolutely everybody. But we're certainly open to hearing everyone out and to making our case for what we see to be the sustainable development of the business. In relation to the final principle, Principle 6, which related to greater collaboration and community engagement in decisions about land, you know, again, we considered ourselves to be performing well here. There's genuine engagement and collaboration with the local community, and we don't always get it right, but we're learning as we go along. So I'll just leave it there, Lucy. I'm aware that time's moving on. One last point to note is that in general, we felt that the pilot framework was maybe more appropriate for rural and larger landowners rather than an urban community body with 1 acre, but we were delighted to be able to take part in the pilot study and to help shape this important part of Scottish land reform.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think the process of going through the self-assessment is something that I'm going to come back to you on a little bit in a little while, if that's okay. Thank you all for sharing your experiences and giving us an insight into how different organisations are working within the land rights and responsibilities principles. What strikes me as quite interesting is, even with just 4 of us here talking about it, you've all come at it in different ways from different places, some from an existing practices that were already very closely linked with the principles, and others who are looking to align your working practices with them. I think it might be quite interesting if we could just quickly go round the table, so to speak, and just hear a little bit more about how land rights and responsibilities potentially aligned with the way you were already working and some of the changes that you've had to make, because I think quite often organisations might seem somewhat daunted by the prospect of implementing them, and I think many of the organisations are potentially already doing quite a lot that fits within the principles. So Tom, if that's all right, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I'd like to think that certain aspects, certainly not all of them, but certain aspects really do align with what we have always done. I think good stewardship is the one that clearly stands out as something that we've always been looking to look after the land for the long-term environmental benefits we can provide, really try to boost biodiversity here. I think possibly that ties in as well with managing the land for public interest as well. You know, a small number of people own a lot of land in Scotland, so it's really up to us to try and look after it and leave it in as good health as we can for future generations. So I hope we tie in with those. We're trying to improve a lot on the transparency and community engagement sides of what we do as well. I guess there are the 2 aspects that we maybe don't quite fit too neatly into, and both of them are the aspects of ownership. You know, that we're private landowners, so we don't tick the box particularly for diversification of ownership here, or community ownership boxes either. In some ways, I think there's benefits to us being private landowners, in that we don't have, say, a lot of internal stakeholders that we have to consult with before we can do things. So if I want to go out and plant some trees tomorrow, I can go and do it straight away. Similarly with our beaver consultations, we really only had ourselves to annoy internally, so we could get on and just put in an application for that and then start with community consultations on that. So it allows us to be relatively fleet of foot in a way that perhaps bigger landowners or organisations perhaps can't. But we have to find other ways, I guess, of ticking those boxes. And I think through trying to open up communication, explain what we're doing, I hope anyway that we can allow people to feel maybe a sense of ownership over what's going on here, and a sense of involvement in the place.
Great, thank you. Duncan, I'll come to you if that's all right.
Yeah, so I think for me, you always like to think you're doing the right thing. And as I said, you know, a strong ethos of us, our organisation has been to try and be a good neighbour. But I think what's really helped us is actually having some guidance that you can refer to of what good really looks like. I mean, your opinion is one thing, but actually having a more formalised process against which you can benchmark the approaches that you've adopted. has been very helpful, and as expected, there's quite a lot of things that we feel we have been doing reasonably well, but there is other stuff where there's clearly room for improvement. And actually until you go through that process, you don't really spot out those things that it's a bit of a blind spot sometimes, and actually just having that more formal process against which to benchmark your standards has been very helpful for us.
Great, thank you, Duncan. Chris?
Thanks, sorry. Yeah, I think probably a bit like Duncan, I think it's helpful to have them there, and I think it's nice to think that we sort of align well with them when we're managing our land. And I suppose what we've tried to do is try and build these into the objectives. And I think in our sort of development of our most current corporate plan and the actions that flow from them, we've tried to build that into that. I think it's like everything else. It's always you review how you do things and think, well, we could do that better and this better. And I think our board has tried hard to do that as well, in terms of being engaging with groups around the country. The last 18 months have not helped that, obviously, because it's not been able to do that. But prior to that, and I think in the future, I think that's certainly what we're wanting to do. I think the other aspect they've also recognised, I think, is by setting up a new partnerships team within the Crown Estate Scotland, and we've recently employed 2 regional engagement managers with a specific responsibility to sort of get more involved and contact with working with communities and local stakeholders, and I think that's an area that will obviously is going out there and sort of making those connections, but also listening and then seeing how we can respond and build that into our everyday work. So hopefully that's showing sort of leadership in that area, but also a willingness to change about how we do that. So thanks.
Thank you. Al?
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I mean, as I've said already, it really was a useful process to go through, and we did feel that we aligned reasonably well with the principles as they were set out. But there was always an element of sort of shoehorning some of our management practices into the framework, and we felt that in some ways we, there was clear overlap between the principles and how we applied them. But just coming back to what some of the other panelists have said, one of the hardest things that we deal with as a voluntary board throughout 18 months of pandemic, where we have all got other commitments, and is communications and communicating effectively with our membership and also with our neighbours. And in relation to that communication, in some ways, it's also a case of managing expectations as well about what we're able to do and how we present that. So in general, yes, absolutely, it was a very, very positive process.
Great. I'm sure those who are joining us today and perhaps haven't started this journey or are in the very early stages of it would be keen to hear how, I suppose, the principles have impacted your activities and what tools, etc., you have used to make sure that you're doing them to the best of your ability. And I think within the resource that you have, because I think obviously, Al, for example, you're very much working with a team of volunteers, whereas the scale of RSPB and the Crown Estate Scotland is quite different to that. So I think it'd be quite interesting to hear also how you've brought your teams along with you and how you've ensured that everybody's bought into this as well. I will jump in with Chris first, if that's all right.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah. I suppose I think that's something we're looking to. I suppose in terms of tools and things like that, what I touched on with the partnerships idea was obviously one of those aspects of bringing in, looking at that. I think the other aspect we've also tried to do is build in a regular sort of tenant survey every 2 to 3 years with our tenants to try and judge how we're doing. and get feedback, and then use that to inform our action planning. Because of the diverse range of our tenants, we obviously had to sort of look at that in terms of how we respond to that, but also I think also trying to see how we can do that. We also use as part of managing our property and working with communities, we also use managing agents on our behalf, because we don't have a huge in-house resource to do that. So we're working with our managing agents across the country to embed that a bit more. And in fact, the tenant survey includes questions about how our managing agents are doing as well. So I suppose it's a learning experience as we go along in terms of how we do that, what can we do better. And a lot of those firms are understandably involved in all sorts of different aspects across Scotland. So it's about working with them across the board, I think, really. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Tom, I'll come to you, because you touched earlier on kind of use of social media and such like.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the way that we manage land, I think Duncan hit on a very important point, that the land rights and responsibilities, it gives you a benchmark by which to set yourself against and judge yourself against. And so I think it's been useful in that sense to know what we should be trying to do with land, which isn't always immediately apparent. And yeah, I think as well, you get a sense of, through social media, maybe the sense of why the land rights and responsibilities exist, which is that there is a big public demand for land to be managed in certain ways. I mean, perhaps Argaty is quite a good example of, sorry, someone's coming in on my meeting here. It's quite a good example of the situation across the board in this area, that we have a lot of very old estates around here, which were probably bought largely for their shooting and fishing potential, with very little regard to kind of public expectations of how land was managed. But I think now things have changed, and people very much do want those few people that own land to manage it in a way that benefits a lot of the country. So I think social media is quite a good way of gauging what the public expectation is, and it does very much align with the statement.
Great, thank you. Al, I'll come to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we use social media as much as we can. However, I would also say that I think our engagement could be better in relation to that. We could be engaging with far more people on social media. But equally, as I said earlier, you know, all of the board members live within about 500 meters of Belfield, maybe a kilometre at most. And people know us, people stop us in the street, we discuss matters, I discuss matters with my neighbours regularly. One of the things that has really come up in the last 18 months, though, is that, I mean, as a business model for a community-owned asset, it is centred around classes and meetings and social events. And that essentially has, COVID has completely hollowed out our business model. So we're having to think long and hard about what a building owned in the heart of a residential community can do for that community in a new normal, where meetings and events and large gatherings might not be appropriate and might not be appropriate for some time. So we have also partnered with another community group called Porty Community Energy, and we're working very closely with them to run a travel survey and a transport survey at the moment to think about decarbonisation across a whole energy approach, so not just from solar and heating, but also from transport. And we are thinking quite seriously about, in fact, working in terms of community ownership. Okay, the community have bought the asset, but what does that mean in future in relation to the land rights and responsibilities statement, and in fact the principle that community ownership should be ongoing and should be expanded. So we're considering at the moment community shares options to fund development of the building, and also looking at the potential for a community-owned EV charging hub. So we're really trying to delve as deeply as we can into improving our asset, into supporting our community. And I would say that runs conveniently in parallel with what's in the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. I expect we would be doing that anyway, regardless of whether that was in there or not.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Duncan, I'll come to you.
So I think some of the other contributors have already mentioned, I mean, communication is a key area and doing this well. I think for us, you know, I mean, we do a lot of communication, but, you know, there's greater recognition, I think, now that communication is a two-way process, and, you know, we need to listen more to when communities approach us and express an interest in a particular subject, and think about how we respond to those inquiries. I mean, just to give you an example, at Abernethy this summer, the community there approached us over concerns about increased numbers of the public, you know, descending on that area, more people staying in the local area and coming up in camper vans and all of that sort of stuff, and concerns about the pressure on the local facilities. And they approached us about this to see if it was a concern for us, and you know, we were happy to back their calls for increased rangering services in the area to help try and manage some of those pressures. But I think just the other point I would make is that I think the Scottish Land Commission seminar that was held and involved a lot of our staff was very useful. We had a huge attendance from our staff, which shows for me there is a huge appetite amongst our staff to do this properly. And, you know, most of us can see that it serves our charitable purposes as well, to engage better with communities. I mean, we want to encourage people to come out and enjoy nature on our sites and to have a better understanding of nature. And we also understand that, you know, you can't just conserve nature on nature reserves. You need to, you know, conserve it in the wider countryside as well. So like the other contributors have said, you know, we do a lot of partnership working as well, and we're keen to do more of that. So those are the kind of things in response to your question.
Fantastic, Duncan. And I think just on the chat just there, the Land Commission team have shared details of how people can get in touch if they'd be interested in running a similar session to the one that you talked about there, Duncan. I'm going to take a question from the chat now, and potentially, Al, this might not be one for you. Tom French says, what consideration is or was given to adjacent neighbouring farms when undertaking projects? While a project may have potential benefits to community or environment, they can have serious detrimental impacts on others in the vicinity, e.g. beavers. Tom, I'm gonna come to you on that one first.
Sure. So I think just before answering the question, I think it's important to state that such is the state of biodiversity loss at the moment, we know that dramatic action is needed. We also know that beavers are very well studied across Europe and that they can bring huge, huge environmental benefits, which is why we are looking to do this. We're in a fairly unique geographical position here in that beavers are only 5 miles away from us, and they're guaranteed to come and reach our farm and all the neighbouring farms in due course anyway. They're spreading very well amongst all the upper Forth catchments. So it's an inevitability that they will come to all of our places. With our project, the reason we're being considered is because of that, because we are within very active range. We hope that it will be a very positive thing for people that they have been consulted about this first, and that if beavers arrive, they'll have had advance warning of it. And we've been through a very thorough local consultation, both with landowners, community groups, community council, as well as local and national environmental NGOs, politicians. It's been a big and exhaustive process to try and inform people about what we're doing and why. And for the neighbouring landowners, I think you know, that is really important, that unlike in Tayside, where by necessity, because of the way that beavers arrived in those waters, everything has been a reactive process. If people have forewarning of it, they can prepare in advance for beavers coming. It can be a proactive situation, we hope anyway. I think the other thing as well to note in the long term, which obviously is a hard sell for people worried about their land being impacted, but I feel that landowners and in particular farmers are going to be the first people impacted by climate change if we don't take big steps to change things. They'll be the first to be impacted by biodiversity loss as well. And I think that in the round, having as many beavers as we can tolerate in Scotland is a huge positive and will in the long term be a win for farming. So that's what we're trying to communicate to people, and I hope that we've done it to the best of our abilities.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Duncan, Chris, I don't know if you want to come in on that one or not. Yeah. On you go, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, species translocations and reintroductions are just one part of a much bigger conservation toolkit. So, you know, things we need to do, as Tom has indicated, to address biodiversity loss. But I have to say, you know, the way species reintroductions and translocations are now managed is very well regulated in terms of, you know, dialogue and discourse around the benefits and disbenefits of such reintroductions. We have a National Species Reintroduction Forum, which is convened by Nature Scot and includes representatives from conservation, land use and other interests. You know, I mean, just to give another example, I mean, the way we do reintroductions these days are very different from probably the early days of species reintroductions. I mean, sea eagles, for example, were one of the first species were reintroduced, but with beaver reintroduction, there has been a lot of public consultation. You know, I mean, the decision was ultimately a political one. It was the Scottish ministers who took the decision to reintroduce beavers to Scotland, and there was a lot of engagement with farming interests as part of that process. And I would just say, I mean, I actually sit on the board of the South of Scotland Golden Eagle project, which is a translocation and a reinforcement project. So there's already a small but fragile existing population of golden eagles in the south of Scotland. That is an HLF funded project. And as part of that project, there has been a huge amount of public engagement and involvement. You know, staff are employed who go out and actually engage with local communities. You might have seen recently, Moffat has been declared the first eagle town. And has had a festival around that subject, which has apparently been extremely well received and has brought a lot of people into that local community and spent money there. Hotels are fully booked and restaurants, etc. So, you know, we need to consider as well the huge benefits that species reintroductions bring. And I mean, just another very brief example, you know, the value of sea eagles to the mull economy, we know, is at least £5 million per annum.
Thank you very much. Chris, if you don't mind, I'm just going to, given the time, I'm going to jump back into a last question from me. And I think what might just be really useful for the people that have joined us today is if we could go around very quickly, because we've got 4 minutes left. And if you could each just give us your top tips for others wanting to understand more about land rights and responsibilities and how they can incorporate them into their land management approaches. And I'll come to you, Al, because you you didn't get a chance on the last one.
That's fine, thanks, Lucy. Top tips, being open to change is probably the first one, and being open to not necessarily, I wouldn't want to call it criticism, but being open to constructive consideration of what you do and how you might do it better. Just because it's IBEAM doesn't mean that it has to continually be like that.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, I would support what Alda said, certainly, and I suppose our tips for so try and build them in from the beginning, where you're thinking about a project or a plan, because it's easier to do it that way rather than having to sort of try and do it halfway through. And I think probably just be willing to be listen and responsive, but also try and I think the point was made earlier about managing expectations, because sometimes it is very difficult to please everybody in terms of how you incorporate everything, but being clear about what you're setting out to do and how you're trying to look at all that together. So and I think also it's that sometimes there are multiple competing interests for something, so sometimes it's quite difficult to find that balance between them. But certainly being upfront at the start and building it in at the beginning, I think helps explain that, and using simple language too. So.
Great, thank you. Duncan?
Yeah, would agree with everything that's been said. I would just, without repeating any of that, I would just say also familiarise yourself with the Scottish Land Commission guidance, and then try and develop your own way of thinking about how you measure up against that guidance. And we've gone down a fairly formal route of doing that, but there are other routes that are equally acceptable, I would say. But agree with absolutely everything that the previous contributors have said.
Great. And finally, Tom.
Yeah, again, agree with what everyone said. I think the only other point just to reiterate is that it's okay not to be ticking all the boxes, but it's important to make sure that you are ticking as many of them as are possible. And I think the Land Commission website is really, really useful as a resource for people looking to see not just what is hoped for from landowners, but how you can do it and why. So I think, make use of that resource.
Great, thank you so much. I've got so many things that I had planned to ask you that I've not even got to. So apologies that we've got to draw things to a close now. But I'd just like to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences and being so open about their relationship with the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. I think we can all agree that their efforts are commendable, and hopefully they will have inspired others in our audience today. As someone that's passionate about community engagement, I'm really heartened to hear the positive impact that increased engagement has been having for your organisations. As Tom just mentioned there's some great examples of the good work being undertaken by land managers across Scotland, and quite a few are on the Land Commission website, so it's worth having a look at the case studies there. But all that's left to do is thank you all for joining us this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.